It's a pleasure to be with you today. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you are. I am going to start my presentation with a few remarks about the bigger picture because again, the focus here on the connection between Ukraine and the Middle East, Europe, even Kazakhstan and so forth. Russia is just everywhere these days. Last year marked the 30th anniversary of the fall of the Soviet Union. And I lived through this as a child. I remember it very well. And I think we can say today that since those remarkable events, Russia has come full circle. The fall of the Soviet Union, it was certainly a single event. A fairly drastic event, but it was also a process of imperial disintegration that a lot of historians have talked about over the years. And the fact of the matter is any kind of imperial disintegration takes many years. Communism became discredited, but Russia's ultimate loss in the defining geopolitical struggle with an equal rival is something that many Russian elites ultimately could not accept. So if we go back really to the very early years of the 1990s, Russia had a very brief window when it attempted to transition to democracy and that sort of a Western style liberal democracy. That window closed very quickly. And rather than turn to communism, what you saw was a return to more traditional Russian statecraft. And it became another process that took many years to unfold. So what we're seeing now is the latest manifestation, another step towards these efforts, these larger imperial ambitions that guided Russia for most of its existence as an independent polity. And so in one sense, of course, these events are perhaps shocking in their sort of severity, but they're also a next logical conclusion of steps that Russia had taken over the years. In fact, to give you one brief example, some analysts in the former Soviet Union warned as early as the 1990s that Russia was going to attempt to take Crimea from Ukraine. And so what we saw in 2014, again, I'm happy to go into details about this during the Q&A. It resulted as a result of sort of many things came together in order to make that happen. But it was also not necessarily a new random Russian interest that sort of sprung about at the last moment. Russian ruling elites resent the primacy of the United States in global affairs. They say it openly, they say it loudly, they've been saying it for years. What they have been working towards is a construction of a new world order. In recent weeks, especially, we've seen them talk about it far more explicitly, but again, they've been talking about it before. What they want is to go back to the end of the Cold War and to replay it with an alternate ending. Again, not to have communism return, but to have Russia's status. Russia is a great power, Russia as a key global player. Russia has never been, for most of its existence as an independent polity, Russia has always played a key role in world affairs. It was always a great power and it could not accept a junior position. So really the question was always not if was Russia going to come back, but how Russia was going to come back. And we're now seeing exactly how it is coming back. Now, a few points. Now, I want to turn to the West. I've talked a little bit about the process in broad strokes that unfolded over the years with regard to Russia. But the West, especially for the last perhaps 10, 15 years or so, had failed to really see Russia's revanchism and failed to see the connections between what Russia was doing in Europe, in the Middle East, and frankly, other theaters as well. If anything, the West tended to dismiss Russian President Vladimir Putin as a short-term tactical opportunist. But the fact of the matter is the West itself, and this is in my view at least, has never really crafted a coherent strategy towards Russia. It was always very piecemeal and with the assumption that Russia cannot be an equal rival. And Russia, for its part, has read these steps as weakness and took advantage of it repeatedly over and over again. In fact, when we think back to 2013, the year when President Obama did not enforce the red line in Syria, when President Assad used chemical weapons, I still remember talking to Japanese officials being worried that if the United States does not enforce a red line in Syria, what does that portend for Japan, and their concerns about China's encroachment on Japanese territories and other territories of China's neighbors. So what we do in one theater always reverberates globally. Everybody's watching us, both our allies and adversaries. And it was after 2013 that Russia also intervened in Crimea and ultimately illegally annexed the Crimean Peninsula. Russia also historically has always seen itself as part of the Middle East. And this is something that I've argued over the years. So of course, there's the Cold War geopolitical dimension, but even from an identity perspective, one thing I wanted to highlight for you today is a quote by Yevgeny Primakov, a skilled Russian Arabist who really charted Russia's vision of a multipolar world in the 1990s. In a recent interview that was published by INSS, the top Israeli security think tank, former chief of Mossad recalls that when he met with Primakov, he specifically said, "We are part of the Middle East." In fact, he repeated, "We are part of the Middle East." And he said it with such force that he banged his fist on a car. At the time they were outside on the road, and he drew blood on his own fist. This is how strongly Primakov felt about Russia's core identity issues that resonate in the Middle East. And so there are multiple reasons why Russia is in the Middle East. What's happening, of course, from the American side is we are shifting increasingly in other directions, and we're not balancing these interests in a very coherent way. And again, our adversaries and our allies are watching this. Now, with regard to Ukraine, a few key points, again, broad points that I wanted to bring up. If in 2014, you could see that domestically Putin's approval ratings were incredibly low, and annexing Crimea gave him a huge domestic boost, really almost this kind of imperial narcotic that Russian analysts themselves, that's the term they use. You could also, and on top of that, Russia did this very stealthily through the so-called polite people, or as they were later described, little green men. They took advantage of disarray in Ukrainian politics and so forth. This was a moment of serious weakness for Ukraine, and it was a lot easier for Russia to assert itself. What is happening now is fundamentally different because Russia is now doing this openly. They're now dictating terms to the West. They're giving the West ultimatums. They are amassing troops, and they're basically encircling Ukraine through several tactics all at once. And I'd be happy to go into this in the Q&A. Ukraine, meanwhile, is in a much stronger position as well. Ukrainian military has now had 7 years of fighting Russia. They've had aid and training. They're ready. They're not in disarray. They also refuse to acquiesce to Russia's terms. With Russia literally holding a gun to their forehead, they're still refusing. And yet Russia persists. So this is my first point. Never before has Russia displayed such self-confidence in dictating terms. My second point is that this is about a lot more than Ukraine. It is also about a lot more than just NATO as well. And this goes to my original point that this is about renegotiating the post-Cold War order, the terms of the post-Cold War order. And in all likelihood, any kind of appeasement, any kind of acquiescence to Russian term will not end there. So I think, in my view, it is incredibly important to realize that this is not just about Ukraine, and this is also not just about Europe, because we know from history that appeasement only invites more aggression. only invites more bloodshed, more problems. So that's not something we can afford to do at the moment. And again, another last point on Ukraine that I want to raise here is that Russia began amassing its troops after two key things happened. The United States completely debauched the withdrawal from Afghanistan. American credibility suffered tremendously worldwide, given how this withdrawal was handled. And again, I'd be happy to go into this into Q&A because I used to live in Afghanistan. I worked in Afghanistan. And I also watched how the Middle East was responding and how Russia was responding as well. And the second point that to Putin showed that the United States was weak is the lifting of sanctions against Nord Stream 2, Russia's gas pipeline. It's a little bit more than that. It's also Russia's main geopolitical project in Europe. So what's interesting, again, is that domestic considerations when it comes to Russian foreign policy, they always matter, of course. But in this case right now, this is not just about a short victorious war to boost domestic public opinion, because Putin's approval ratings have already been pretty high. This is about a lot more than that. And you're also, across multiple theaters, we're seeing Russia entrenching itself further in Syria, very slowly taking more steps in that regard, being very active in the Iran negotiations. Russia remains active in Libya with Turkey. And this includes the South Caucasus. Again, I'd be happy to go into this in the Q&A as well, because as part of the global geopolitical picture, Russia and Turkey are both also asserting themselves in the South Caucasus, but Russia, again, is gaining the upper hand. Now, the last point I want to make is about Kazakhstan, because, of course, we've seen the recent events there. And I think these events took many by surprise, frankly, including the Kremlin. The fact of the matter is this protest was in many ways a long time coming, but at the same time, just as with the Arab Spring, many other popular protests, these are very hard to predict. In this case, what sparked the crisis was the drastic spike in oil prices that especially affected people in Kazakhstan in the West, because they especially depend, because given how much they depend on their cars, this especially affected that population. Kazakhstan also has a very large Russian ethnic minority. And what we're seeing for the first time in Kazakhstan is that Russia has deployed peacekeepers. So in other words, the crisis was not something that Russia started, it happened organically, but Russia immediately jumped on the opportunity to assert itself, assert its interests, assert its control in another part of the post-Soviet space. And Kazakhstan is especially important because it is in Central Asia, where Russia is now looking far more closely given the US withdrawal from Afghanistan. So this is the first time we're seeing a Russia-led peacekeeping mission through the CSTO, and that is the Collective Security and Treaty Organization. That is it's a Russia-led military alliance. So it's a pretty important development because Russia has never done this before. And it's another sign of Russia's assertiveness and self-confidence. And the way they've presented this mission is, again, in opposition to what NATO does, to what the United States does. The Russian embassy directly tweeted that unlike NATO that intervenes in foreign countries and causes chaos, our quote-unquote peacekeeping mission will bring about stability. So it's always cloaked in these anti-American tones. And again, I'd be happy to go into Q&A because there's a lot of, there are some fundamental key differences in how Russia conducts peacekeeping. The biggest concern really is that when Russian peacekeepers enter, they generally never leave. And that's really something we need to be concerned about because just like in Belarus, where you had Alexander Lukashenko essentially owing his survival to Putin, and helping Putin put additional pressure on Ukraine through his control in Belarus, what we might end up with is a situation where you have another authoritarian who also owes his survival to Vladimir Putin. And the last point, I guess I'd like to conclude with is this. It is, of course, important for the United States to focus on China. I don't think any analyst would really disagree that China is a critical long-term strategic challenge to the United States. But the fact of the matter is, a definition of a great power is one that can tackle several threats at once. And in fact, Russia consistently for years has been operating in multiple theaters, handling multiple threats at once. In this sense, it has been acting as a great power. And it has been doing this with the aim of undermining American influence, the rules-based global order that the United States has worked so hard to create and to preserve, the world order that has brought an unprecedented era of peace and prosperity that the world has never seen. So we cannot simply ignore Russia. And at this point, we don't have a choice. They've made us focus on them. But a great power needs to focus on simultaneous challenges at once. I also don't think Russia is going to split from China anytime soon. If anything, there's a very troubling convergence between these two without resorting to a full-scale sort of treaty alliance. The partnership between them is a strategic one. I believe that the United States retains a number of advantages. The fact of the matter is there has never been a power, global power like the United States. It is a unique development in world affairs. My concern is that advantages can be squandered. And unfortunately, we've been doing a lot of this with our incoherent policies over the years. One was our over-reliance on sanctions at the expense of using other tools. You're seeing Russia utilize tools across the border, all tools that they have available, including military force. In fact, any negotiations that Russians start involve some kind of Russian military operation. We're not really doing that. And I'd like to see us show that when necessary, we will go through with threats, that we will enforce threats, because otherwise Russia is just going to keep pushing and pushing and undermining global stability. Again, global, not just in the Middle East, not just in Europe, but everywhere. Thank you.
So we've already received several questions, Anna, for you. Let me start by asking a question that was submitted, and that pertains to the Crimea. To what extent does Russia have a legitimate claim to the Crimea? Was Crimea separated from Russia, the former Soviet Union, in the 1950s? And can we not give, let's say, the Crimea to Russia as a bargaining chip in exchange for backing off on Ukraine?
Thank you very much for the question. It's a great one. In short, look, if you were to ask Russian officials, they would say that yes, they have a legitimate claim. My answer to that is no, a pretty hard no, and I will explain why. There is, of course, the history between Russia and Ukraine, of course, is incredibly complicated, incredibly painful, astonishingly painful, and Russia has not reconciled with the pain of that history. And here I'm especially referring to Holodomor, which I'm sure this audience is familiar with. It's Stalin's genocide against the Ukrainian people. And I think it is legitimate to call it genocide. It's not a word I'd use lightly. I reserve that word for very, very select instances. And I'd be happy to explain why I feel comfortable using that word. That aside, the reason why Russia does not have a legitimate claim is because with the fall of the Soviet Union, Russia signed a number of documents. In 1997, there was a key, and I'm blanking out on the full title, it's very long, I apologize. I can find it for you later. The document was based on the Helsinki Accord of 1975. In this document in 1997, Russia agreed to accept Ukraine's sovereignty, to respect Ukraine's sovereignty. This was a treaty obligation that Russia undertook. And in exchange, Ukraine had, in good faith, that Russia will uphold this promise, this obligation, not just promise, Ukraine has given up its nuclear arsenal to Russia. And this was the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world that Ukraine shipped to Russia. So Ukraine kept its end of the bargain. And we could, of course, go back to the Cold War. But the fact of the matter is the post-Cold War documents, a treaty enshrined, again, these are treaty obligations that Russia signed, Russia was signatory to, that go beyond any kind of verbal promises, I think is the key argument for why Russia does not have a legitimate claim. And on top of this, you can see Ukrainians themselves choosing to turn to the West. In other words, if you had seen a genuine push inside Ukraine, saying we don't want to join the European Union, we don't want an association agreement with the European Union. If there was a genuine move in Ukraine to really want to be part of Russia, perhaps we could have a different conversation. But the fact of the matter is, Russia is literally holding a knife to their neck, and they're saying no. And you can, of course, find pro-Russian Ukrainians. Again, look, this is a very complicated issue, but all in all, Russia engineered an intervention. It engineered a referendum. Everything that happened here was not expressing the true will of Ukrainians. It also confused everybody at the time. I mean, I remember talking to Ukrainians during Crimea, and a lot of people were just lost and confused. So my very long answer to this, because this is a critical question, I want to make sure I really do it justice, is that it is Russia that has consistently, time and time again, failed to uphold its treaty obligations towards Ukraine. And Putin never considered Ukraine a real country. He explicitly said so. He's on the record telling George W. Bush, look, where he says Ukraine is not a real country.
Thank you. Anna, you wrote an excellent paper on the connection between the current situation in Ukraine and the JCPOA negotiations in Vienna. Could you share with everyone your take on what the connection is between the two and how Russia could leverage one for the benefit of the other?
Sure. Well, the connection is that because you're seeing a much more assertive Russia everywhere, you're also likely going to see Russia more assertive in any kind of international negotiation that involves a key global issue, such as the Iran nuclear issue. What I wrote and what I would caution about is trusting Russia to think that to come up with some kind of a deal where they can propose to be a little bit more helpful on the Iranian deal in exchange for concessions in Ukraine, because I can see Russia crafting some kind of a deal like that. And what I wrote is that the fact of the matter is, although Russia always preferred a non-nuclear Iran, they were never as worried about this issue as we were, and rather it used the process to extract concessions from the West and to dilute sanctions against Iran. So I would be very wary of any kind of Russian deals on the Iran deal in exchange for Ukraine, for example.
Thank you. We've received several questions about the issue of next steps that the United States could take. You mentioned that we've been too reliant on sanctions. What are the other tools that we could employ to thwart Russian aggression toward Ukraine, specifically moving NATO troops, or perhaps employing our leverage vis-a-vis the pipeline?
Yeah, and here, let me preface this question by saying that unfortunately we missed a lot of opportunities in this regard specifically. When the Ukraine crisis started, we should have immediately sent lethal military aid to Ukraine. In other words, rather than signaling that we will do it should Russia become more aggressive, we should have done it right away. And in fact, George Bush had actually done that in Georgia in 2008. So for anyone who might say that this might come across as an escalatory move in Georgia in 2008, after we had provided such aid, it did not lead to a full-on war between the United States and Russia. It did not lead to an out-of-control escalation. Um, uh, we can still do that. Unfortunately, at this point, given the state of negotiations, that might be seen as a little bit more escalatory than it would have before. But what we could do is perhaps strategically place strategically and surgically place some of our NATO troops, for example, in Poland and elsewhere. Analysts have been arguing about this for years as well. We can do more exercises. We can also make clear that we were not going to budge easily. This is an incredibly difficult issue at this stage, because at this stage things have gone so far and so many opportunities were missed. I often go back and forth. In fact, when I talk with my colleagues and contacts that I know in NATO and in the military, we all often sort of go back and forth on this, because on the one hand, at this stage, we have to have some kind of negotiation and conversation with the Russians, because they forced us in this position. The key is how to do this from a position of strength. And I think it has to do, again, more with talking about non-NATO issues, because their demands are total non-starters, and they know that when it comes to NATO. Those demands are non-starters.
To what extent can we use the pipeline as for leverage?
Well, look, I think pipeline absolutely should be sanctioned.
Could you explain what we're talking about?
Sure. So Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2 is a gas pipeline. It's a Russian project with Russia's state-led Gazprom. Gazprom is the chief Russian state industry energy provider. There's no Russia doesn't have major independent energy providers. They're all state controlled, and Gazprom is the key one. It's a state entity. Russia historically uses energy as a geopolitical tool of dependence. And Gazprom, the idea behind Gazprom is that it is to build a pipeline to deliver Russian gas. I'm sort of thinking through a map here of Europe, bypassing Ukraine, sending Russian gas into Germany, bypassing Ukraine. Right now, a lot of this gas goes through Ukraine, and Ukraine's economy benefits from transit fees, but also from the Ukrainian side. If Russia has critical energy infrastructure in Ukraine, to a certain extent, it protects Ukraine, because Russia is not going to bomb its own key asset. But if Russia doesn't need to worry about it, it gives Russia an added opportunity to attack Ukraine. Because it is a tool of dependence, it's not just a purely economic project. The discussions about this go back years. In my view, Nord Stream 2 absolutely should be sanctioned. Europe had been trying, in fact, for years to diversify its reliance on Russian energy, but it has not quite panned out perhaps as well as it could have. And that's perhaps a separate conversation to have. The reason why it's so important to sanction this is because Germany is the key to Europe. Control of Europe is through Germany, and Russia understands this. And that's why we need to sanction it. And there was bipartisan consensus on this in Congress, I should add. So the lifting of the sanctions was really quite shocking.
Right. A lot of questions also about the connection between Russia and China. Can you go into the extent to which those two countries are working together to the detriment of the United States?
Sure. A few kind of broad points on this. First, the Russia-China convergence has very deep roots. It actually goes back as far as Gorbachev. I've been recently reading some literature on this topic that goes back to Gorbachev's Perestroika era, when even Gorbachev was looking to China's economic model. And with the fall of the Soviet Union, we saw a lot of discussions between Russia and China They ultimately signed a strategic partnership. And the roots of that are basically about 30 years old. So it is not just kind of certainly after 2000, approximately after 2012 or so, you saw an intensification of these contacts. And especially after Crimea, after 2014, there was another shift further in that direction. But it's important to know this is not a new shift. What Russia and China have in common is that they both resent American primacy in world affairs. And one way or the other, slightly differently, they see this a little bit differently, they would like to erode this order. They don't always agree, and analysts, the analysts will often point out 2 points of disagreement between Russia and China for every act of convergence, and that's absolutely legitimate. But the fact of the matter is they've both at this stage agreed implicitly that what they care about the most is taking America down to size, bringing it down to size. And the Russian state believes in this so firmly that ironically they're willing to de facto accept a junior position to China at this stage. And I emphasize de facto, especially because publicly China treats Russia very differently. They're very respectful to Russia. So this junior status is not, it's not as publicly visible as it is vis-a-vis the West. You're also seeing them carving out spheres of influence in the Middle East and elsewhere. You're seeing them conduct more joint military exercises, which is quite important. Again, especially after 2012. And what the division of labor here is that whereas China is much stronger in the economic realm, China cannot match Russia in the military realm. And if anything, China is learning from Russia's military tactics and operations. And that's quite a worrisome trend, even as, put it this way, I think the red line for many analysts is a full-blown sort of signed strategic alliance, a document of alliance. I don't think that's in the cards, but I think that shouldn't be the red line of concern because enough is going on there.
Okay. Hey, could you, Kate, bring us up to date on the status of the talks between the United States, its partners, and Russia on Ukraine?
So this week, just this past week, there were a series of talks. The most important ones, I think, were bilateral talks between the American and Russian delegations just this Monday. And following that was a discussion in Brussels with NATO and the now revived Russian NATO Council. This week was the first week that Russia had participated in such NATO discussions because after Crimea, the Russian NATO Council was suspended. Russia was kicked out because of Crimea. Russia considers the United States the most important interlocutor here. They consider the discussion that took on Monday a lot more important than what took place later in the week. So far, these were only the initial talks, and they're very different assessments of this amongst analysts in terms of how it went. Nothing concrete was decided for sure. People described it as a stalemate. Some had said it could have gone a lot worse. I'm actually not so sure because what the Russians have talked about at the end of these talks, especially on Monday, is how pleased they were that the United States was taking their concerns seriously. By simply the virtue of having this discussion, by showing how seriously we took Russian threats, this was already a kind of an initial win for them. It's unclear to me where this is headed, but I'm not sure if it's off. Look, it's not worth maybe off to a kind of disastrous start, but also I'm seeing it in much more neutral terms and positive terms, I guess, put it this way.
Okay. One question that's arisen is, can you describe the status of the relations between Israel and Russia?
Sure. Wonderful question as well. In fact, I will have an article on this coming out in a peer-reviewed journal, hopefully next month. Russia and Israel also celebrated last year the 30th anniversary of restoration of full-fledged relations. And in broad strokes, certainly if you look back to the Cold War, when the Soviet Union did not recognize Israel, the situation now is far better. I would describe this as a very pragmatic relationship on both sides, where there is a degree of convergence and also an understanding of certain limitations. What worries me the most about Russia-Israel relations is that the Israeli government continues to believe that Russia can curb the activities of Iran-backed militias in Syria, and from the Israeli perspective, it's understandable. So it's not an unreasonable position to take. It's just that over the years, there's been no evidence that Russia was doing this, and you're still seeing Israeli officials talk about Russia pushing Iran out of Syria in some capacity. What worries me is that, as in the past, that's just not going to happen. And meanwhile, Russia is entrenching itself further in the region, and it's building leverage across all spheres. It's a case of slow-moving influence. And so what Russia does vis-a-vis everybody is they build leverage. And I think it's very clear in the Israeli case because once Russia entered the Syrian theater, Israel had little choice but to deal with Russia because it was there on their doorstep. So what worries me is Russia continues to position itself as this mediator that can talk to all sides and ultimately sort of play everyone off against each other.
And would you say that Russia was instrumental in enabling Israel to strike back at adversaries in Syria and Lebanon?
Well, look, Russia acquiesced to Israeli airstrikes ever since from the moment Russia allowed this. Theoretically, because Russia controls the Syrian spies through this umbrella air defense system that they've set up, Russia could say, we don't want you to do this. The fact of the matter is they've allowed Israelis to carry out their airstrikes. It's a fairly limited step. I'm not sure if I would read too much into it. And again, it was to their advantage. It was to their advantage because ultimately Russia wants everybody to be weaker. And so if Israel weakens Iran a little bit, that's to Russian advantage as well.
You've written and spoken in the past about how Putin's foreign policy is influenced by his domestic considerations. Could you explain a little bit about that?
Sure. I think in the West, we have more of a tradition of separation of foreign and domestic policies. And that's not to say that there's no connection in the West either, but traditionally in Russia, that line between domestic and foreign was always blurred to the degree that I think is hard for many in the West to understand. Russia was really created at its core as this besieged fortress, a fortress besieged by foreign enemies. That was the narrative, the founding narrative of the Russian state. And the Russian state used that narrative historically to bring people together, to get people to sort of rally around the flag and put aside their differences. And in Ukraine in 2014, I've alluded to this in my remarks, Putin's approval ratings were very low. Really, they reached a historic low, whereas Crimea gave it an enormous boost. Much of what Putin is doing externally is to stay in power, to secure his legacy. And historically, Russian leaders, what do? They take territory. So an element of what's happening with Ukraine is also Putin, especially after 20 years in power, he knows he's not immortal. He's also thinking about his legacy, his restoration. So in other words, Russia as a great power, image of Russia as a great power abroad is inseparable from sort of domestic cohesion internally, if that makes sense. And again, that's been a pretty consistent Russian sort of form of behavior. It's not unique solely to Putin.
Mm-hmm. We have a follow-up question on with regard to the pipeline, which is do you foresee Putin using that pipeline as a weapon against the West?
Yeah, look, the short answer is yes. Yes, I do. I think that the entire project is precisely meant to be as a geopolitical tool of against the West, especially about. So it starts with Germany, and again, once you have control of Germany, Germany is the key to control in broader control in Europe. Over the pandemic, one of my readings was that I reread some of Daniel Pipes's work. Daniel Pipes is a preeminent Russia historian. I highly recommend his writings. And what's interesting now is when in his book about the rise of the Bolsheviks, he had talked about how Germans were seduced by the lure of business deals with the Bolsheviks, and they were a little bit naive about their intentions. A little bit, a lot of echoes of this are playing out with Nord Stream 2 right now, that you're seeing many Germans, again, seduced by the importance of business contracts and profit. And look, you can also argue that to some extent that's not unreasonable, but it's the failure to see the broader geopolitical consequences of this.
Mm-hmm. Very good. A couple of military-related questions. To what extent can Russia realistically use hard power in Ukraine and elsewhere simultaneously? And then what is the capacity of the Ukrainians in the event that there is an invasion to resist Russia? Will there be an outbreak of guerrilla fighting?
Sure. So first, I don't think Russia wants a major full-scale, like full-blown conventional confrontation with the West, and probably not with Ukraine either. What I've argued over the years is that Putin is pursuing a strategy of limited means. In other words, if the Soviet Union was utilizing massive resources across the globe, overthrowing regimes with military interventions and so forth, really sparing no resources, Putin extracted a very key lesson from that you can't really keep doing this. This is unsustainable. What he's doing is utilizing as little means as possible to achieve maximum gain. I think when it comes to Ukraine, and this adds to the reason why I think we need to stand firm in our negotiations right now, because I don't think Putin wants a full blown out war. What I think he's more likely to do is try a third option in Ukraine, and that is try to seize a small strategic chunk of Ukraine. For example, maybe formally annex Donbass, and Donbass is a region in eastern Ukraine that is currently being disputed. This is where Russia started a war after annexing Crimea. At this point, through the so-called Minsk agreements, that this was the peace accord signed after Crimea. Through the so-called Minsk agreements, you could possibly see them trying to do something nefarious that way, or some other strategic territory that cuts off Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, and that's geopolitically extremely important because, again, it would surround Ukraine, it would economically damage Ukraine tremendously. The other part of the world that I would look at is Kaliningrad. Kaliningrad is a very small enclave between if you look at the map, it is sandwiched sort of between Belarus, Poland, and the Baltic states. It's a tiny piece of land, and if Russia could carve out some kind of corridors through Ukraine that gives it more, that establishes the connection between Kaliningrad and Russia, that's something else to watch out for. And here, Belarus is important. So I think I would look, but for these kind of third options that are less costly, because Russian people, I have to say, are much more casualty averse than they have been historically. If there was a full blown, goes to your second part of the question, if there was a full blown conflict, the fact of the matter is, two things will happen. Ukrainians will fight, and the Russian military will probably overwhelm Ukraine. I think that's the short answer of this. They will fight with all they've got. they will not back down. It will be tragic and it will be incredibly bloody.
And is that with conventional forces, or is that a guerrilla campaign?
I'm sorry, I forgot that part of the question. I was thinking about conventional forces. But I mean, guerrilla warfare is going on right now. So if we're going to see more of that, that's something that Russia can sustain for quite some time. If I may also, now that I'm thinking back to your other question, the connection between other theaters, right? How is Russia able to sustain this? The reason why Russia has been able to sustain these military engagements across multiple theaters is precisely because they're limited in nature. They're small, especially in Syria. If anything, the engagement in Ukraine has been much more substantial than in Syria. And that's why I think they can afford to do this in Kazakhstan as well, and in other parts of the world.
Thank you. As we're coming up to the top of the hour, let me ask you to speculate on what's Mr. Putin's next surprise step. No one expected him to, most people didn't expect him to go into Crimea. Maybe people didn't expect him to get so involved in Syria. What's up his sleeve next?
Let's see. Great question. I think so. I would watch Central Asia much more closely. I'd watch Kazakhstan. South Caucasus. A very interesting development has been brewing with Armenia. Several weeks ago, it was announced that Armenia is looking to normalize relations with Turkey. And on the surface, it looked like very good news because historically, the one thing that prevented Armenia from coming out of Russia's grip is its lack of relations with Turkey. When I started thinking about this a little bit more closely, however, what I saw is that for a long time, Russia has been pushing for this normalization. And the key question is why? Because the one thing that they're not going to do is let Armenia out of their grip. And Turkey is playing a very interesting game here as well. So I'd watch the whole South Caucasus. I would also watch in more months ahead, probably closer to the summer in Syria, Russia's negotiations on the so-called cross-border resolution on humanitarian aid. And my colleagues and I, in fact, are working on an article on this topic as well, because Russia is quietly entrenching its business interests in Syria. Let's see, I would also look more into Africa and Latin America, and these are not parts of the world that I necessarily watch with a lot of detail, but Russia has been very active in Africa, far more than people give it credit for, far more than Russian analysts give it credit for. In fact, Russian troops were just deployed to Timbuktu. Same way, several years ago, Russian paramilitary forces were deployed to Venezuela. Depending on how things might pan out, something like that might happen there as well. And Ukraine, of course, I'm sure everybody will be watching.